I actually build the stories into the presentation. But I've been saying this one line that if a user can ruin your network sucks for almost a decade now. Because I guess I'm sick and tired of hearing the same things like, oh, a user clicked on something and our network that went down. And frankly, if a user can click on any significant network at all and they, took your network down, your network sucks. It's the you who is stupid, not the user in this case. Because the reality is the user is going to do something. It's inevitable. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's inevitable. A user's going to do something, and it's your job to make sure the user can't, for lack of a better term, ruin your network. Okay, so let's talk about two different attacks to lead off. First attack was the highly sophisticated attack, and I am being very sarcastic, regarding Twitter. As many people know, a few months ago, what happened was several or a few dozen high-profile Twitter accounts basically were hijacked because a computer mastermind, essentially 17-year-old computer mastermind, mind you, was able to launch, according to Twitter, sophisticated social engineering and phishing attacks against Twitter, and was able to go ahead and compromise the control systems, or the admin systems, I think they were specifically named, and was able to then go ahead and change passwords on very high profile accounts such as President Obama's account with 120 million subscribers, and then sell that access supposedly to some other criminals who then used it for the mastermind attack of getting maybe $100,000 by putting a Bitcoin scam up. Yeah, so anyway, Twitter, again, they had a network engineer. I'm not trying to disparage the person, but I am being very specific on it was a security engineer, not an executive, essentially, who went out and was telling everybody in detail how Twitter was hacked. And basically, they kept claiming how it was a sophisticated social engineering attack. And in response, they're going to put some awareness training up. So in the meantime, let's talk about the 17-year-old mastermind, doing my Dr. Evil quotes. So yeah, this was a 17-year-old who basically did lots of social engineering. He determined the location of the administrator tools and then conducted phishing attacks, some of which might or might not sound sophisticated, but basically contacted through a variety of different people, figured out that there were admin tools who might have general access to the admin tools, Twitter, to its credit, if you want to call it that, had multi-factor authentication in place. And what they did was the mastermind, and again, Dr. Evil quotes mastermind, basically vished and called Twitter admins up and said, hey, we need you to log in. You should go to the site and enter your multi-factor authentication, which they then used essentially as a man-in-the-middle of attack, and captured the MFA for those people, logged in as the admins, and then reset the passwords, allowing criminals to have access to those high-profile accounts. And then you go ahead and you figure out, Twitter said again, high sophisticated social engineering. The reality, though, is when you stop and think about it from a rational security perspective, in the first place, it turns out that 20% of Twitter, in other words, about 1,000 people, had access to those admin tools. And I don't know about you, but 1,000 people have access to admin tools, pretty bad on occasion. Yes, you probably have a need for some people to do that. That's one thing. And then stop and think about it. And this is what a lot of people forget. Back in 2018, there was a contract employee of Twitter, I believe based in Germany, who left Twitter and said, you know what, we need to take down Donald Trump's account. And he just did that on his way out the door. And Donald Trump's account was taken down for a few hours and everybody was horrified. So here's what you got to realize. Number one, Everybody understands the insider threat exists no matter what. That's a given, period. But yet they still allowed 1,000 people to have similar access on other accounts, such as Obama's account, with 120 million subscribers, without implementing any sort of not just multi-factor authentication, but multiple users, for example. I mean, I don't know about you, but accounts with 120 million people, you want to change the password on that? I mean, hell, that would be like C-level approval, in my opinion, for accounts to that extent. But anyway, Twitter went ahead, blamed it on sophisticated social engineering, despite what I would consider, yes, give the mastermind some credit for putting in the effort to figure it all out. But again, many systematic problems occurred throughout that whole thing. Now let's go ahead and switch to Cloudflare. Cloudflare, right around the same time, a significant portion of the Cloudflare network went down. And again, Cloudflare essentially is an infrastructure provider. They allow for hosting of different websites and so on. And those websites were able to go ahead. And so anyway, Cloudflare had a problem and a significant portion of their network went down. Now, in this case, it turns out it was the CEO, I believe his name is Matt Prince, came out. And Matt basically went ahead and posted specifically what was going on and said, here's the problem. Some engineer made a typo in a router table or something similar. I forgot the specifics, but it was essentially a typo by an engineer. And somebody replied back to Matt Prince on Twitter and said, gee, I'd hate to be that engineer. And Matt Prince pretty much immediately replied back saying, it's not the fault of the engineer. It's a failure of leadership. It's a systematic failure on the part of Cloudflare that allows for a single user making an innocent typo to allow for the whole infrastructure to go down. And frankly, that is what you might call extreme ownership. They didn't try to put the blame anywhere. They realized it was a systematic failure that one person making one typo innocently, let alone somebody who did any research to figure out how to take it out, was allowed to do that. And they did it in what I would consider a very admirable way, giving credit, saying, people will make mistakes. It's our problem that a mistake is allowed to propagate and cause significant damage to the network and all of their customers. And again, they took ownership. Now, I like to apply a lot of other things, and it shocks me that in cybersecurity, very few people, especially all these people talking awareness that love to mention things like mental models, gamification, and all these other buzzwords, don't recognize something that's been out for 100 years called safety science. In old school, and first I'm going to talk about old school safety science. Twitter, for example. When somebody injures themselves in a factory environment or whatever, old school safety science said, why did the user do what they do? Why were they so stupid to injure themselves? They were essentially focusing on the proximity of where an error occurred. And then when they did an analysis, it's like, okay, why was the user wrong? Why did the user do what they do? Why did they do that? Same thing with the medical profession. When a surgeon would commit a patient died in the middle of surgery, they would do a medical inquiry, and the medical inquiry would say, hey, why did that doctor accidentally cut the wrong thing? Why did they give them too much anesthesia or something like that? And that's how everything used to be. And that's the equivalent of saying, hey, if there's a canary that dies in a coal mine, why is the canary so unhealthy? Just give the canary a gas mask. And as most of you know, the analogy of a canary in a coal mine is based upon the fact that it's an unsafe environment that causes the canary to die before a human would die. And the canary is just kind of like the sensor, very inexpensive sensor. But in cybersecurity, like what Twitter said, well, they were the victim of a sophisticated social engineering attack. Let's give them more training. Again, it's like saying we need a healthier canary, as opposed to looking at it as a failure of the entire system, which I'll go into. Now, here's the issue. When we speak about the user, we're talking about the proximity of the error. And with the proximity of the error, such as mechanical breakdowns and things like that, it's like, gee, why did the user do what they do? Why did the user click on the phishing link? Why did those Twitter employees go ahead and, and enter in the multi-factor authentication under that sophisticated social engineering attack? The reality, though, today we realize there's a significant difference, for example, between a user, and this is modern safety science. There's a difference, for example, between a bus driver going out drunk and crashing into something, causing the bus to break and lives to be lost, compared to a bus driver who otherwise acts completely reasonable, and then having a defective bus given to them, such as a bad axle where a tire might fall off or something. Likewise, with medical postmortems, they've gone ahead and stopped and realized, you know what? If a doctor makes a mistake during surgery, we have to acknowledge that the doctor generally does not Hannibal Lecter and does not intend to kill people. And the bad action resulted, frankly, not from the one action that we're concerned about, but from a whole decision string that went back maybe 100 or more actions. And figure out, gee, maybe if they had better information at the start, the issue could have been avoided. Maybe if there was like another sensor, like they had a better blood oxygen type of reading or something like that, they would have done different things and so on. So now these postmortems look at the entire event from start to finish and figure out how they got to the point and what could have been done throughout the whole operation that would have resulted in better situation, which again is the new school of safety science. In cybersecurity, I essentially translate that into a user is as much of a part of the system as the computer is. And a lot of people want to paint the users as a paragon of virtue. They want to say the user's your first and last line of defense, and those people would be 100% completely foolish, because your user is just the proximity of them making an error. If you leave a user as your first and last line of defense, you have failed, you have no understanding of system science, and period. That's a given. And likewise, any safety incident results from a failure of the entire system. If, for example, somebody gets injured in a factory environment, why did they injure themselves and so on? This is why, for example, they have back braces, knee pads, steel-toed boots and all that sort of stuff. They look at how all these things came to be, all the enabling factors, and realize that, for example, if something drops, like if a heavy object drops on the toe of a factory worker, again, steel-toe boots prevent that sort of damage. That's why steel-toe boots exist. But on the other hand, maybe the object was too heavy for that person to lift on their own or handle on their own. And what else could have been done, such as possibly, giving them lighter loads to move around or putting better protections in place or so on. But again, proximity is just a symptom, as is user error a symptom when we're talking about cybersecurity. Let's talk about something that, much like the Cloudflare incident, unfortunately something that was a little bit more dire was the 737 MAX jet crashes that happened, give or take, a year or more ago at this point. In this case, what happened was the Boeing 737 MAX jets, two of them, Lion Air, and I forgot the other airline that was involved, but essentially the planes went straight into the ground. And everybody was saying, why would a plane go straight into the ground? It must be the pilot's fault. Similar things happen with several other planes, but in these cases, the pilots couldn't recover. So was it pilot error? And what happened was, people started, look, could the pilots have saved the plane? And you know what? Yes, the pilots could have saved the plane in theory. But the two incidents where the airplanes crashed were not the only incidents where problems happened. And there wasn't the proper training when these incidents happened in the past, to like say, here's what went on. But when you stop and look at what really enabled the 737 MAX jets to crash, it turns out that there were systematic problems that occurred during the design of the airplane years before, possibly almost a decade before. So for example, what happened is in previous versions of the 737 jets, they were looked at, the cockpit was the same, so there wasn't a perceived need for any extra training. However, what they didn't tell the pilots, and maybe they put it as a note in a book that the pilots were supposed to read, but a little note inside a big document, they basically said, well, we have these things called AOAs on side of planes. AOAs is angle of attack sensors, and these angle of attack sensors generally say if the plane's going up or down. Now there's two of them, one on each side, but if there was ever a discrepancy in past versions of the 737, they would say, hey, there's a discrepancy between the two, Mr. Pilot or Miss Pilot, you need to do something now. And what happened was, you know, there was a warning and a specific what the issue was. On the other hand, with the 737 MAX jets, they rewrote the software, and one thing they did was they made this warning indicator an option. So this default indicator that the pilots had readily available, they only had that if the airline paid extra for it, which some airlines did not. So anyway, the problem was, so when there was a discrepancy between one saying the plane was going up, another saying the plane was going down, the software said, well, we'll default to the plane going down, because if the plane's going down, clearly it's safer to bring the plane up, because planes only crash when they hit the ground. But how you get a plane to go up if it's going down is, ironically, you aim the plane down to pick up speed, because picking up speed gives the plane more lift. So the plane was supposedly getting more lift, but they never turned the plane back up to take advantage of the lift. The indicators just kept indicating the plane was going down, so it just kept aiming down more and more, and the planes crashed into the ground. The indicators were turned away, so could the pilots have saved the plane? Yeah, if they turned it off and kept off the autopilot, but the reality was these issues happened years before, with the pilots given no proper warning, no proper training, or anything to that effect. Now, in regards to cybersecurity, you know, we hear about the human firewall, we hear about the users being your last line of defense or your first line. It's not really you. We've been fed a bunch of crap over the last decade or so, where the users are somehow the paragons of virtue who would do the right thing if you just give them the opportunity and the training. Now, that's like if you go to a gym, you have the bros in the gym, you know, drink more protein, bro, you know, more squats, bro, whatever the case is. Call each other bro. I call that bro science. Does it work what they say? Maybe, maybe not, but really they're only saying it because they heard it from somebody before. So it's just like these old wives' tales that get passed down from one bro to the other. And that's what we have in the cybersecurity field regarding users. We hear about creating the human firewall. I mean, regular firewalls suck. Why do we want a human one? I mean, get a grip on that. And then your users as the last line of defense. If your users your last line of defense, you failed as a security professional. And why is that? Specifically because you have to account, what happens if a user is outright malicious? You know, if and 3% of users will be malicious if given the opportunity. That's just the statistics on the average number of sociopaths or psychopaths, 3 to 5%. So at least 3% of your users will cause harm if given the opportunity. And if you make them the last line of defense, which they should never be anyway, but even especially in the hands of a malicious person, you have failed as a security professional. And frankly, all this goes down to the focus on the proximity of the error. They think if they fix the proximity of the error, you don't have to worry about how the error occurred and how the error was allowed to proliferate. And that's the big problem. Here I have Newman. Hopefully you all know who Newman is. Even if you don't in this case, kind of irrelevant, because all I'm doing is I needed a picture to show accounting instead of just having the word accounting. In this case, and the reason I do accounting is just imagine what would happen if a CFO walked into a board meeting and said, you know what, we just had a $20 million error, but that was because of a user, and users are inherently flawed, and you can't blame the user, you can't blame me because I'm given inherently flawed systems. That CFO would be fired before the end of the meeting. Why? Because it's the CFO's job to properly manage financial resources, and there is the realization that users are critical throughout the financial processes. You can't go ahead and say, gee, the users made a mistake, so it's not my fault. No, the critical part is, for example, how many of you work in an organization where if you don't fill out a time card, you don't get paid? It's a given. If your organization requires time cards or the equivalent and you don't properly fill it out, you will not get paid. And nobody ever says, oh, that's so unfair. Likewise, I tell this story a lot, but there was one time where I was traveling and the people I were reporting to, they wanted me to fill out travel vouchers. Why? Because that was their financial process to ensure nobody abuses travel reimbursement. So I had to fill out the travel voucher. I had to also go ahead and submit receipts for each and everything, including a $4.63 Frappuccino. So I had a $3,000 plus travel voucher rejected because I went ahead and forgot a $4.63 receipt for a Frappuccino, and they didn't care that I still provided a $3,000 hotel bill, $1,000 airfare, whatever it was. If I didn't have everything, I didn't get paid or I didn't get reimbursed. And nobody said, oh, we're so unfair. They just went ahead and required it because that's what we require. That's what they required of people to get reimbursed. Here's, a lot of people don't know, but I'm certified as a master scuba diver trainer. And in this case, here's a picture of a class, small class getting certified for open water. And the way I know this is the scuba instructor would be the person in the bottom right corner. That person is watching the person to the left, trying to do a neutral buoyancy, basically hover, slightly do a fin pivot as they call it, where they put the weight on the fins and go up and down as they breathe. Now, I first heard the term you can't, C-A-N-T, stop stupid, when I was taking my scuba instructor course. The course director said, you can't stop stupid. And I'm sitting here thinking, you know what? Our whole course is about stopping stupid. Before users get in the water, we give them hundreds of hours or dozens of hours of training. Now it's all online. They have to take a test. Then when they pass the test, they come to a dive school. Then the dive school, if they're smart, gives them another test in person, just in case they had somebody else take the test for them. And then once they do that, they're like, okay, you seem like you know enough. Then they check all the equipment. They go ahead and then put them in the water and see if they can float for a period of time and do some basic swimming. Do they really care how well they swim? No, it's really just a test to make sure that they don't freak out in the water. Then once that's done, they put them in the shallow end of a pool and make sure they can put their head underwater, and then slowly bring them down to the deep end and get familiar and do skills. Once they're familiar and do the skills and we're comfortable with the students, we bring them to an open water area that's not going to be more than 30 feet deep, because it's hard to kill yourself in 30 feet of water. But still, the dive platforms like you see on the screen are probably about 15 to 20 feet deep, usually at the lowest, because again, dive instructors want to be safe. So anyway, even when you see all these people and we check their equipment, the facilities we bring them to have insurance, a dive school has insurance, the instructor has insurance. We even take out a small medical policy on the students when they get in the water and everything like that they usually don't know about, just in case. We know where the medical equipment is. We know the closest hospital. We know how to call 911. We have first aid kits. We have oxygen kits, and so on. And I go into that, and yet still, here's one instructor looking at one student, and as you can see, it's hard to see everything going on, but a smart instructor brings the dive, they bring, like in the back, you see there's an assistant instructor or dive master that watches the class while the instructor looks at people. And when I certify people, I always try to bring somebody with me to make sure nobody does anything quote unquote stupid while I'm not able to pay attention. But anyway, and then statistically, all of this makes diving safer than bowling, and that's a true fact. I don't know where I heard it from, but again, it has never been proven false to me. So where does the blame fall when somebody ends up injuring themselves or a user causes damage? When you look at everything from a safety science perspective, 90% of an injury, 90% of accidents happen because of the environment. Only 10% happens because of it specifically due to a user action. And giving you an example, I was once doing an awareness program for a manufacturing organization, and we were walking through the warehouses. And as we were doing this, I was given the tour by the safety manager, and the safety manager points to these yellow lines down the middle of the warehouse floor. And he's like, well, you see these lines? We just put them in about 3 months ago because we had a series of accidents where forklifts were driving into people. And you know, we did a whole bunch of different studies, and at the end of the day, we said we're just going to draw a line and say forklifts stay to one side, people stay to the other, and incidents pretty much went away. Now, the only incidents we have are due to users or people being on their cell phones and walking across the yellow line accidentally, just drifting over, or similarly, forklift drivers, you know, being on their cell phone and not paying attention. So those type of things happen, but again, 90% of the incidents are a result of it. Oh, let's see, went the wrong way. Anyway, so what is that other 10%? You know, what is the 10% that's the user's fault? Carelessness. In other words, they are aware, they just aren't paying attention to what they're doing. Because you can be aware and just not pay attention. You might have blatant ignorance where you're put in a position of being completely unknowing what you're supposed to do. Lack of training in the case of the 737 MAX jet pilots, who basically were all good pilots who were put in a bad situation with a lack of training. And then there's also the outright malice. In other words, the people who are just going to do bad things because they were given the opportunity to do so. Now, at a high level, this is where your awareness program fits in, you know, where you can go ahead and try to get people to behave more diligently and so on and do the right things. Now, but still, that's only 10% of the problem. Now, the other aspect is awareness itself is only 20% of that 10%. So really, only 2% of a solution to the problem. And this slide represents applied behavioral science. In applied behavioral science, there's the ABCs, to make it simple. A is antecedent. Antecedent is essentially information you provide that's supposed to influence a behavior. The behavior is then exhibited, or a behavior is exhibited, and a behavior generates a consequence. The consequence then goes ahead and influences the behavior. So for example, if you put your hand on a flame and you get burned, the consequence, being burned, will cause you to avoid the behavior in the future. On the other hand, let's say again, a server comes over in a restaurant, tells you the plate's hot. You're like, grab the plate anyway, either accidentally or you're like me and just being obnoxious, grab the plate because, hey, I'm a man, I can handle it. But if I burn my hand, okay, you were right. You put down all the plates that follow. On the other hand, if I don't burn my hands and the plates aren't as hot as they were built, in the first place, I should figure, hey, maybe the food hasn't been kept warm appropriately. But either way, I'm going to say, hey, the server gave me bad information. Those plates aren't really hot. So I'm more inclined to grab the plate the next time. And even when I go to another restaurant, I'm still more inclined to grab the plate away from the server. And that's essentially what happens. In cybersecurity, you know, we keep telling our users, for example, don't reuse your personal passwords on business accounts and vice versa. And what happens? We tell them that, but they're like, hey, you know what? I don't want to learn a new password. I'm going to reuse my password. What's the consequence for that? 99.99% of the time, there is no consequence. The only time I know I can demonstrate a consequence in the recent past, for example, was when people were reusing their, you know, people obviously have their email as their user ID and password. And what happened was, periodically, you can go to a site like, you know, You've Been Pwned and see which email addresses have been compromised. The dark web has whole libraries of them, you know, email addresses and passwords that have been compromised from countless sites. And bad people went ahead and decide, hey, let's see if I take those email addresses and passwords and attempt to just stuff them into the Ring system, Ring, the home camera systems, and people just took it, stuffed it into the Ring system, and every so often they came up with success where people reused their email addresses and passwords on the compromised accounts on their Ring accounts. And then you had the cases that made the news where people were able to log on to people's home cameras and talk to their kids, insult the kids, be pornographic, and so on. And that happened, and those are the only consequences we can point to. But tell that to your users because they don't usually hear those things. Let's also figure out how to apply this strategically. And to apply strategically, I use the concept of boom. Boom is a counterterrorism type of concept, and you have the principle left of boom and right of boom. In cybersecurity, every so often you hear somebody say, we need to move more to the left. Being more to the left means you're going to try to prevent the attack from occurring, as opposed to moving to the right, which means be reactive. I'll be upfront with you. Sometimes you want to be right because it's not cost effective to move left. But either way, that's the principle. And what is really, going down deeper, prevention. In other words, if you think there's a terrorist attack going to occur, you're going ahead, and unfortunately, given today, you have people monitoring, like, the militias, the extremist groups who are looking to, unfortunately, like in Pennsylvania, they were going to attack the ballot counting places at the Philadelphia Convention Center, but they were on these websites monitoring extremist groups to go ahead and figure out, hey, these people are potentially going to do something, let's watch them, and then we're going to interdict them when the opportunity occurs. Then protection. I mean, and I hate to use today again, but polling places in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, they put police in front of those places to go ahead and to monitor and protect those people. So that's the protection. Then we have the point of boom. In boom, this is where, for example, on airlines, we have hardened cockpit doors as an example. We have bomb or blast resistant cargo holds and things like that. So if there is a bomb and that goes off, the plane will ideally not have a big hole in it and crash. So again, you figure out at the point of boom, how do you protect things? And then you have your response. So if there is some sort of issue, that you have the first responders, they know how to respond appropriately, such as looking, for example, making sure they know how to look for secondary explosions, making sure they know how to get to places, have the right equipment, and so on. You then have to go ahead and figure out, hey, here's this. Now, do we have hospitals? Do we have enough hospitals who are trained and prepared? And then also simultaneously, do we know how to evacuate a city, or simultaneously, do we know how to shut the city down to prevent bad people from getting out, and so on. But counterterrorism strategy, and you have different people usually involved in different phases. So different people are involved in monitoring different groups of people, different people are involved in protecting facilities and so on, different people are involved in responses and so on. And unfortunately, in cybersecurity, usually it's just you. And, just keep that in mind. Now, I also want to introduce the concept to many of you of user-initiated loss, because much like, the stupid user, a user ruining your network, here's the issue. A user doesn't ruin your network. A user just initiates an action that can result in loss if you allow the environment that allows the user action to actually cause damage. If, for example, a user clicks on a phishing message and they don't have admin privileges, a lot of malware will not be able to install. Ransomware will generally not be able to install if users do not have the ability to load software onto a given system. So that's just one example. But also, you have to realize that if a user clicks on something, you facilitated that malicious email to be in the user's inbox. So that, again, is on you. So you've got to realize that you essentially want to go ahead and stop the user from being in the position where they can initiate loss. But then likewise, acknowledge they will at some point initiate loss for whatever reason. Now it's up to you proactively to say, what are the potential damages a user can do? What are the cascading effects of a user action? And how can I mitigate those cascading effects from causing damage. Now, let's talk left of boom. In other words, how do we prevent the user from being in a position to initiate loss? Now, clearly, there are many different types of losses. In the ideal situation, you want to possibly take a user out of the position to be in the whole chain of events. So, for example, let's say you go ahead and you just like have one of the problems are users sometimes opening up what are they? Invoices. Yes, invoices. And when those users open up an invoice in the accounting department, you know, it could contain malware, and that happens sometimes. Well, a lot of companies put in place these systems that automatically receive invoices, and those systems that receive it filter out malware so it doesn't happen. So essentially, in that way, you're taking the user out of the decision chain to open up, for example, an email attachment, such as an invoice. That's one case. But either way, try to take the user out of the decision process, but simultaneously, try to filter out attacks if you can. So for example, with email messages, with potential phishing messages, if you have, for example, DMARC, that's going to filter out some messages that might be malicious. If you have email servers that have anti-malware on it, that should filter out ransomware. Anti-phishing might filter out some sort of scam emails as well. So again, you're trying to create this environment that filters it out, because if a user clicks on the message, you have failed, your system has failed because the user has an attack in their hands. That should not happen. So you want to also create a strong security culture. And what I mean by that is, I use the example when I was at NSA, I once went ahead and was working shift work. And I had to do something on a plotter where they had a mechanical arm that moved back and forth. And when I was working on that, I had to take my badge off so my badge didn't get caught in the mechanical arm. And one day I went to run out to the restroom, and I was like, you know, ran back, and then I couldn't find the badge because I forgot to put it back on. And then I'm looking for it, and finally my coworker sarcastically goes, "Are you looking for something, Ira?" I'm like, "Where's that damn badge?" And he's just laughing and everything. Do you think I ever forgot that badge again? Of course not. The culture was reinforcing the whole wearing of the badge. That's just one example. But you want to have a culture creating people doing the right things. The key thing, though, is governance. And this is where a lot of security professionals fail. We look at governance as a set of documents that's required because somebody requires them, and somebody writes up those documents and they sit on the shelf. Governance, policies, especially procedures and guidelines, should be living documents. Those documents should be processes that people have to follow consistently. And you should look at your governance and say, are we essentially putting the right procedures in place that says how a user is to do their job and exactly what actions do they take? How do they make decisions? And the decisions are probably the most critical part. I'll talk about that later. But frequently, we don't define governance. We just slap together a bunch of technologies and say, hey, there we go. And the user's just supposed to do what they do their first day of training. At the point of boom, this is where the user has the opportunity. Now, and unfortunately, in cybersecurity, especially awareness people, they fail to recognize the importance of user experience. User experience should drive most of user actions. In other words, you should be guiding people how they should do their job properly. A couple of examples include, well, one example at least includes how, you know, tagging a message as an external message. This way, if a bad person sends a phishing message, says, I'm the CEO, do this, yeah, at least you know, the user should know it's coming from outside the organization. So that's guiding people to do the right things. You know, not, for example, if a user goes to attach, you know, a sensitive file to an email, again, the user experience should say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be attaching sensitive information to a message going outside the company. But then this is also where awareness kicks into play. And at this point, people should have the ability or the training to say, here's what my process is, you know, how do I go ahead and do my job? Now, this is where I really especially beat up the awareness people, because generally what you should be doing is You should not be going ahead and saying you need to be afraid of these people. A hacker will call you up and try to trick you into asking for your password. You know, we shouldn't be training. It's like hackers will try to do bad things. You should be saying, you never ever give out a password for any reason. That's a policy. It doesn't matter who calls you up. It doesn't matter why they're calling you up. You never ever give out your password to anyone for any reason. We are essentially training in cybersecurity. We're essentially training Elmer Fudd, and hopefully you know who Elmer Fudd is, or I hate you. Elmer Fudd was always on the lookout for the wascally wabbit Bugs Bunny. He wanted to hunt Bugs Bunny, and he was always looking for somebody with, you know, that was naked with big pointy ears. If Bugs Bunny ever put on a dress, Elmer Fudd could not recognize Bugs Bunny. It was that pathetic. But that is how we are raising our users. We're training our users to be on the lookout for the wascally hacker, as opposed to telling them, here's how to do your job right. That's a critical failing of us. So anyway, write-a-boom. A loss has been initiated. You need to design an environment that expects a user to do something that might result in harm. And that means that, yes, somebody should be out there saying, not just random, like, what are countermeasures? I need random countermeasures. They should be sitting there and saying, okay, what are the abilities users have, and how do I need to potentially limit those actions? How do I potentially limit those, the harm, the source of loss? And you should be, and again, doing an analysis of user-initiated loss. Now, at the same time, you need to, much like the medical profession and everything, after there is an incident, go back and analyze the incident, figure out why it occurred. You know, what caused it, what's enabled it, you know, and frankly, look at where you got lucky sometimes, because some incidents, I've been on incidents where, you know what, one time, and this was actually the case of the, what was the virus that just came out, that Maersk, if you read Wired magazine, Maersk, the big shipping people, there was like the Eternal Blue vulnerability, one of the NSA leaked vulnerabilities that allow a WannaCry, for example, I think it was. Maersk Shipping, which is a multi-billion dollar company, their whole network was taken down. The only thing that was their saving grace was there was an outage in an African country that had an incredibly unreliable connection to begin with. And if it wasn't for that connection being unreliable and out, they would have been totally screwed. But they essentially reconstituted their whole DNS infrastructure because one system was protected because of an accidental outage. And you need to figure out similar things. Where and how did you get lucky? So anyway, it sounds difficult, but as I mentioned previously, safety science looks at where losses come from, accounting looks at where losses come from, operations does this. That's the whole Six Sigma, total quality management, or whatever the quality buzzwords are today. And everybody does this. Now consider, if 90% of loss results from a user-initiated loss, again, the Verizon DBIR, all significant studies show 90% of all significant losses occur with the user as the primary attack vector. And frankly, if you can go ahead and figure the user will be the primary attack vector and mitigate the 90% of incidents, you're going to get the other 10% of incidents as well. Let's talk about how this might be, you know, all of you, you're secure in West Virginia. Let's assume you're all, you know, in the US, you know what W-2 forms are. So every year there's thousands of W-2 attacks that happen, and successful W-2 attacks where somebody essentially finds a low-level HR person on LinkedIn. They send a message saying, I'm the CEO and we just hired a new accounting firm. I need you to send all the raw W-2 information out to our new accounting firm, who will then process the W-2 forms. Always happens. So what could theoretically stop this from a start to finish using, you know, the concept of boom? First, we look left of boom. We do mail filtering. We tag messages as external. We go ahead. Maybe we want to go ahead and tell people not to be so robust on their LinkedIn profiles, as an example, so the attackers know who to send these attacks to. But then at the point of boom, here's the biggest thing. Besides of the tagging, besides of the user experience, we tell users, you know what? I don't care who's asking you for W-2 information, which is essentially PII. What we're doing is, if we are going to release PII, you as a low-level user are not allowed to release PII. Any requests for PII have to go through the head of HR. And the head of HR has to release it only with the approval, for example, of the general counsel. And that's just one example. And so you go ahead and the low-level user should say, hey, this says it's from the CEO. I've been told I'm not supposed to do it even if it is from the CEO. I'm just going to send the information to the head of HR, which I do, and it's out of my hands. And your awareness program should be training in how to handle PII, not what to be afraid of, not every little trick a hacker might do. And then anyway, so you assume that the user forwards it on, but even if the user doesn't forward it on, or even if the hacker theoretically tricks the head of HR, there should be warnings of attaching PII to a file destined for an external system. That's number one. And then data leak prevention software should also filter out the message, even if the user ignores the warning to get the message out and stops the message from going out. So again, here you should see your user is not your last line of defense. You should have technologies as your last line of defense. Now, the overlap, again, handling a PII in the case of W-2 for CEO fraud, W-2 fraud, stops all releases of PII in general. Data leak prevention stops a variety of attacks. Filtering of incoming emails for malware, phishing, and so on, again, stops a variety of attacks. Warning of attachments, again, a variety of attacks are stopped. You know, I already said this, but if you can mitigate 90% by focusing on user-initiated loss, you should get the other 10% as well. Here's the thing, people hear me say this and they say, oh, you're saying I don't need to waste money on awareness. Awareness, first off, is not a waste of money. Awareness is still mandatory, because for a user to actually be able to click on a phishing message meant your whole technology infrastructure in filtering out emails has failed at that point. So that's number one. Number two, once we've filtered out all that, you know, now we do need users to let us know that things have failed and let people know that there's attacks in progress, because your attacks failed to allow the user to get the message, and the technology failed to allow the mail to get to the user, and technology might fail after the user might do something. So you do need a user to be aware. And, you know, frankly, you don't spend that much on awareness to begin with. Most people don't spend enough money. So you're getting a fairly good return on investment. Every time a user doesn't open up their spam file and open all the messages, it's a success. You're not counting all the successes that you have because they're not as obvious. But anyway, awareness has to be, however, not what to be afraid of, but how to do their job properly. And that's most critical. So again, the big problem we have in cybersecurity is we tend to throw lots of tactics around. We throw some technology, we say, okay, we'll have an email filter, maybe we'll have an awareness program, maybe we'll have DLP, but you're implementing that as random tactics. You're not implementing that as a comprehensive strategy. Again, safety science looks at potential injuries and says, where is the best place to mitigate these potential injuries? And it might be before, it might be during, it might be after. Likewise, in cybersecurity, we need a strategy for figuring out how we mitigate user-initiated loss. And it's not just throwing random tactics around. You need to figure out, hey, wait a second. Maybe we go ahead and maybe we don't put prevention to stop certain types of attacks. Maybe we expect the user to do the wrong thing, but at least if we lock the system down, for example, don't give user admin privileges, lock down the most critical data, we can ease up some controls elsewhere. But that should be done strategically, not randomly, not by a random decision, not by a tactical decision, but a strategy. The most important takeaway, again, you've got to treat your users like the canaries in the coal mine. You don't put a gas mask on a user. You basically say, we're going to try to make the user as good as possible, but we realize they will fail, and those failures tell us where our system is otherwise weak and needs to be improved. Oh yeah, even more important, everybody should buy my new book, You Can't Stop Stupid, available on Amazon for pre-order now. And with that, I think I am done. I don't